we might make a start because we've got a lot of great information to get through. I'd like to welcome you all. Good to see you. Good to see you, John Mullard. Hello. I'm Virginia Birrell, the CEO of the Australia-China Business Council in Victoria, and I extend a very warm welcome to you all for our leadership series. This is the final one for 2020, and our series offers the wider community the opportunity to hear from leading speakers who work in the increasingly complex global environment and to get their views on the historical context, current issues and opportunities afforded by our training relationship with China. Just a reminder that this event is being recorded. You will have access to the recording after the event. We'll send it out with some key takeaways, so you can look forward to receiving that. Today we're joined by Dr. Geoff Raby, AO, who will be joined in conversation with longtime friend of ACBC Victoria, Mr. Danny Armstrong, Managing Director of ShineWing Australia. And I'd like to thank and acknowledge ShineWing Australia for their support of today's event. Also zooming in from ShineWing is our Victorian President, Matthew Schofield, so a warm welcome to you, Matt, as well. I'm sure that Geoff Raby needs no introduction to most of you. He was Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011. 27 years in the public, he completed his ambassadorial term to establish Geoff Raby and Associates, a Beijing-based business advisory firm. An Australian Foreign Affairs veteran, one of our most prominent and respected commentators, Dr. Raby was the Deputy Secretary to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and has held a wide array of additional senior positions within the department. He was also the Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the World Trade Organization, Geneva. In recognition of his contributions to advancing relations between Australia and China, Dr. Raby was made a Friendship Ambassador to the Shandong Province and an honorary citizen of Chengdu City in Victoria's sister city province of Sichuan. He was awarded an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2019 for his distinguished service to the Australia-China relations through senior diplomatic roles and to multilateral trade policy development. Geoff, I'm delighted that you're able to speak for us today. We'll also be hearing from Danny Armstrong, who will moderate the audience questions. Danny is the Managing Partner of ShineWing Australia. He has a strong commitment to the Asia-Pacific region, having lived and worked in Asia for 10 years for banks such as CBA and NAB. He's a proven interest in helping businesses succeed in Australia and China more broadly, and as well as Asian businesses looking for success in Australia, which makes him a great attribute to today's online briefing. The timing of Geoff's presentation coincides with the launch of his new book, China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New Global Order, which has already received great public support and interest. We're delighted to ask Geoff to unpack some of the findings from his book today and to provide his expert forecast for the future of bilateral relations and what it means for our member businesses. So without further ado, Geoff, I'm delighted to hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia. Thank you very much, ACBC and to ShineWing for this event and for so graciously including me in your proceedings. Yes, the book came out last week. It's probably the first book ever to be dedicated to COVID-19, without which it would never have been written. It's a book that had been in my head for the best part of a decade, but with various things, and we all know how our lives get busy, I never really had the clear space to have a serious run at it. And I did with COVID lockdown in Sydney, and it basically represents about 13 weeks continuous frenetic writing. But at a time when the bilateral relationship just seemed to go from worse to worse, and when China just has become such a dominant issue for our public discussion. So without further ado, I might just basically outline the main arguments in the book. I think, and some of you who are familiar with my AFR monthly columns will not be surprised that I approached the issue of our bilateral relationship with China from a very big picture position, basically in terms of the changing world order and China's grand strategy. So I think the first point to start with is China's grand strategy. People often say, what does China want? And essentially, you need to answer that to be able to understand what its grand strategy is. China's never laid out in a single authoritative government document in so few words what its grand strategy is, but it can be defined very much by its actions. And there are two key elements to China's grand strategy. One is ensuring territorial integrity of China. And the other is the continuation of the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And both these elements actually reinforce each other. The belief in Beijing, and this book, by the way, is written very much from a perspective of Beijing. So security issues are seen more through the eyes of China in this book than they are through Canberra or Washington's eyes. So China's grand strategy is about continuing the rule of the Communist Party and maintaining territorial integrity. And as I said, these two things reinforce each other. It's firmly believed in Beijing that, by many, many people in China, amongst the elites, that the Communist Party is essential for maintaining stability and security of China. And were China's territorial integrity violated, then the Communist Party would have great difficulty in remaining in power. So these are quite powerful, mutually reinforcing considerations. Where all this derives from, it's worth considering how the Communist Party came to power in the first place. In 1949, with the end of the Civil War and the defeat of Japan, the Communist Party of China inherited not a state or a nation, but rather shards of territory, which were deeply fractured and divided, and that they had to sit around and fashion and build a state out of so many pieces, which was the first job of nation building for the Communist Party. And they had to secure China's territorial integrity. There's a very interesting book came out late last year called Haunted by Chaos by a Pakistani geopolitical strategist who works out of Harvard. And I think it helps to understand the mentality that sits behind much of the Communist Party's thinking about itself and the world, that chaos is the big fear in China, and policies directed at stability. And China is, I believe, haunted by chaos. So if that's true, then the next point I make in the argument is that China's grand strategy is actually based more on weakness than on strength. It's a defensive strategy, and China's capacity to project power globally, and I'll come to that in a minute, is seriously constrained to the point where I describe China as a constrained superpower, or rather more colourfully as Prometheus bound. Its capacity to project power is severely constrained by its history. It has 22,000 kilometres of land border to defend, 14 countries on its border. That's by its geography, by its history. It's still an empire with unresolved territorial issues, and very serious ones inside its border, such as Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, and now, because of its own making, Hong Kong. But most importantly of all, China's capacity to project power is constrained by its lack of natural resources and energy. Now, this is something that's never really discussed in much of the strategic and geopolitical analysis of China. China, for most of its 3,000 years of continuous history, has been actually a very rich country. And those of you, and I'm sure most on the call, who have traveled widely around China, will have a great appreciation of the natural abundance of resources in China. The problem is that after the communists took over and Chairman Mao had a population expansion policy, suddenly there was a lot of Chinese from the 1950s onwards. And then that didn't matter so much either, because basically China was still fairly poor. It was only from the late 1990s, really, less than 30 or about 30 years ago, that China starts to find that it's becoming richer. And as it becomes richer and does so rapidly, suddenly the resource base, which has been so sufficient and able to sustain civilization for 3,000 years, is inadequate. And you find from the late 90s, China increasingly turning to world markets to source all the resources and energy it needs to keep its economic machine going. And you go through a series of tipping points. It's very interesting to watch it. I mean, from 97 or thereabouts, China starts to import crude oil. By the end of that decade, China's becoming a major net importer of crude oil. And in 8 years' time after that, towards the end of the first decade of the 21st century, suddenly China is the world's biggest importer of crude oil. And it's the same with so many other materials, and of particular interest, of course, iron ore. And there's a subsection in the chapter on resource constraints on China, which I call the iron ore wars. Because once China goes through these tipping points at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, we get into the resource super cycle. And that was driven entirely by China's massive economic growth, increase in demand, soaring prices, and that shaped the first decade of the 21st century. And for the Chinese leadership, from a strategic point of view, what they discover, and it was never meant to be this way with the reforms in Open Door, they suddenly discover that they are utterly dependent on world markets for everything they need to survive. And guess what? All of those materials, energy and resources, go through the Straits of Malacca or the South China Sea. It's an absolutely massive strategic vulnerability that Chinese leaders and the Communist Party inadvertently created for themselves through the very success of the policies they implemented to promote economic growth and development and to raise people's living standards, which of course are seen as essential to maintain the rule and power of the Communist Party. So when Canberra or Washington looks at the South China Sea or the Straits of Malacca, what they see, strategic people in Canberra or Washington, is a thrusting, bullying China that's throwing its weight around as its economic and military power rises. In Beijing, they view the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea as the boot on China's throat, as a massive strategic vulnerability, through which their supplies of raw materials and energy can be stopped in a heartbeat by the United States. And even today, despite all the massive Chinese investment in its naval capacity, it's still 1, 2, or more decades behind the United States in force projection, at least probably 20 years. And so China sees a world of enemies. And as they say, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean you're not being followed. And this massive unintended consequence of economic success, this new strategic vulnerability. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative needs to be understood in those terms. Its origin was not some grand plan as Washington or Canberra strategic analysts argue that China is somehow going to impose a Sinocentric order on the world. Today, that might be an intention, but as I argue in my book, in these matters, China will overpromise and always underdeliver. We have to understand not only intent, which can be attributed to China's actions, but also understand really well its capacity to realize that intention. And I think it's heavily constrained. But the BRI was really initially to open up alternative supply routes to avoid the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. And two of the first projects were the Pakistan Economic Corridor into the Indian Ocean and the dual gas and oil pipelines across Burma. I try and lighten the book a little bit with some travelogue from my own experiences. And I describe how in September 2006, 14 years ago, I traveled from Kashgar in Xinjiang over the Kundra Pass, the highest road pass in the world, into the Hunza Valley in northern Pakistan, And what did I find along the road in Pakistan? Because the road on the Chinese side was actually very good. On the Pakistan side, it's a disaster and very, very dangerous. All along the road, Chinese surveyors, they were already beginning to survey and plan reconstruction of that road. And of course, that road also links Central Asia to the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and is the main corridor from Central Asia to the sea. And to the extent that China can fix the infrastructure, which it has, including the Port of Gawler, it can position Xinjiang and Kashgar in particular as the central hub of an East Asian economic region. And the fourth constraint, I mentioned geography, the borders, the history, the empire, the resource constraint. The fourth constraint is soft power. And here in China's got a major problem in projecting power. You can't actually be hegemonic power simply by dint of arms or force, hard power. You need to also have soft power to be effective and to complement any hard power that you have. And China's soft power, in my argument, is heavily constrained by the fact that the soft power narrative must all go through the propaganda organs of the Chinese Communist Party. And it might sell in China, it certainly doesn't work overseas. And I would argue, despite all the massive expenditure on projecting Chinese soft power, it's been very much wasted. And probably, and I have no good evidence for this, but it's a good line, probably amongst all of the states, Chinese states' wasteful investments, and of which there are many, the most wasteful is probably being CGTV television. And I do have some numbers on that in the book. And at the same time, China's invested massively in the soft power. It's standing in international polls in terms of trustworthiness, image, a country you'd like to follow or be associated with. It's standing across all of those metrics has fallen dramatically. So there is a big problem. So I don't feel China will become a regional hegemon for all these sorts of regions, let alone a global one. Its trajectory to its ascendancy that's carved out then is very, very different to the one the United States carved out. For the United States, after the Civil War, it had no unresolved territory inside its borders. It had no hostile borders it needed to defend, and it had all the resources and energy it needed for its economic growth and development, other than people, which it sucked out of Europe in large numbers. It's a very different path to global ascendancy that the US traced than what is possible for China. In fact, China can't replicate that, and we should get rid of that thinking out of our heads. But there has been, and here we come to the Australian dimension of it, there has been, over the course of the past decade, the single biggest power shift, or the greatest power shift in modern history has taken place. And the situation we find ourselves in is an ascendant China challenging the dominant power, and the dominant power has decided to resist the ascendant power and to push back against a rising China. Now, Hugh White, in a very prescient book 10 years ago called The China Choice, described the situation we find ourselves in today almost exactly. 10 years ago, he said that a time will come when the ascendant China will force the United States to make a choice. And it's important to note, most people who haven't read the book, or anyone who hasn't read the book, thinks the China choice that Hugh's talking about is about a choice Australia will have to make. It's not. The choice he's talking about is the choice the United States will have to make, and that is whether to accommodate China's rising power or to resist it and push back. And what's happened in the past half dozen years or so, the US has decided that it will push back against China's ascendancy. And then Australia, because of its alliance relationship with the United States, has firmly tied itself to the US in policies, although the Australian government never wants to say the word, but policies which in effect, and if you sit in Beijing, absolutely look like containment. Be it through the Quad, and the Quad's an interesting beast. It was once a grouping that no one dared speak its name. It's come out of the shadows lately. But the question I've posed in many columns in the AFR over the years is that how is Australia's interest served by being in a group where 3 other members of the group are China's strategic competitors? The US, as the dominant power, is embarked on a course of containing China. Japan has ongoing, almost daily territorial issues with China, and India has its own territorial issues across the northern frontier. Australia has no outstanding historical interests with China. We are not a strategic competitor. And if the Quad is merely a talking shop, as it was presented for a number of years, of democracies, the dialogue of democracies, or the diamond of democracies, as former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe used to describe it as, then why aren't other Asian democracies in the Quad? Why isn't South Korea there, or the Philippines, or Indonesia? And you can answer it how you like, but the answer Beijing has drawn, as a point of fact, is that this is set out decidedly to contain China. And there's a lot of enthusiasm in Canberra lately because finally, after our pleading to participate in the Malaga naval exercises along with India, Japan, and the United States, from which we've been excluded for many, many, many years, we have now been brought into the Malaga exercises, presumably as a result of the conflict between India and China in Ladakh back in June. We have now militarized the Quad. The Quad now has a military dimension to it. But it's one of many things we've been doing, joined to the hip with the United States, which essentially are part of a strategy to contain China. And I argue in the book that it's not in our interest to do that. And as a result, I think we've become an outlier amongst all other countries who have difficulties with China. Every country in the region looks on China with suspicion. Some countries like Vietnam, Philippines on occasions, even Indonesia further away, all have conflicts with China. Everyone is worried about domestic interference. But we are the one country out of all the countries that have got problems, including Canada, their relations with China, that have had their diplomatic relations frozen, and against which China is exercising economic coercion. Now, economic coercion is an established part of Chinese statecraft, and that's partly because China doesn't have many other ways of projecting power. And because its soft power is so weak, it does fall back much more on hard power than many other states. More on sharp power. It falls back on sharp power more than any other states. And that includes economic coercion, interference in domestic politics, cyber, you name it. And so we obviously have to harden our defenses against that. We have to harden our traditional military capacities, but equally we have to develop strategies by which we can engage China, not seek to contain China. And ultimately that will come down to us having a more independent foreign policy from the United States, a more authentic Australian foreign policy that recognises our interests whilst overlapping a lot with the United States, and we share values and so on, which are often talked about, but they're not exactly the same. And we are certainly, for a start, much more economically dependent on China than the United States is or will ever be. But we ought not to see the relationship either in purely transactional terms. China is the dominant power in the region, but not the regional hegemon. We need to have a proper, ongoing working relationship to engage China, not just because of our commercial interests, but across the whole range of security interests in the region, from arms control to asymmetrical security like terrorism or people smuggling. We need to be able to engage China in regional forums and work with China, of course, multilaterally, particularly in the WTO. So, and we have 1.5–2 million China residents of Australia, citizens of Australia, who are from Chinese ethnic background, and we must be very careful to protect their interests in Australia, not to have their not to have them feel that they're discriminated against in Australia. So it goes well beyond the transactional, why it's so important for Australia to have a proper constructive policy of engagement with China. And I don't believe, as the media constantly is presenting of late, and our politicians largely, that we face a binary choice. It's not a choice of sycophancy or hostility. It requires diplomacy to navigate our way through those extremes and to have a constructive engagement with China. So, Virginia, I might stop at that point. I hope those remarks were helpful and take some questions.
Thank you. That was enormously interesting, Geoff. Thank you very much. And I think very timely to be bringing the USA into it. If I could perhaps now introduce Danny Armstrong, and Danny, ask you to make a few comments, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Virginia. And I'd like to join Geoff in thanking ACBC for putting this event on today. And of course, we at China Australia are delighted to be involved. And thanks, Geoff. I think your take on China's strategy relating to maintaining its territorial integrity and continuation of the CCP as ruling party makes sense, of course. I think your perspective on how that's driven BRI from a strategic perspective is very interesting. So I guess, obviously, heading into the Q&A, the big question on everyone's lips now is, what impact, if any, do you think that the outcome of the US election will have on, firstly, US-China relationships, and secondly, will there be any flow on to Australia-China relations as a result?
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, look, clearly that's the big elephant in the room now. And assuming all goes smoothly and that President-elect Biden does become the president without too many challenges on the 20th of January next year, for sure you'll see a very big change in the tone with which the US-China bilateral relationship is conducted. That it will be less confrontational, and I think that already is a good thing for Australia and provides space for Australia. And I think also you will not get the same emphasis that we face a binary choice. I mean, if you listen to Secretary of State Pompeo's more recent rantings almost about US policy on China, it wasn't just threatening containment, but to push China back, in Pompeo's words, to its rightful place, whatever that may be. And we've been associated with that. And I think it's unfortunate that that's helped to, if you like, frame and colour the way Beijing views us, so that when specific issues come up in the bilateral relationship, they're viewed on the basis of a lot of suspicion and already existing hostility towards us. Clearly, though, the US will continue to see China as a strategic competitor. And Biden, in some essays he did some months ago in the run-up to the election, basically sketched out, and it's only sketchy, a sort of framework for his foreign policy with China, which combines strategic competition, so pushing back where you need to put back, and I do push back, and I do think, as I said about Australia, we all need to harden our defences, be they traditional military or cyber, or the internal anti-foreign interference. But also Biden talks about strategic cooperation, and I think that's key for us. So it's going to be difficult for the Australian government, because at the top of Biden's list is climate change. And China has already committed to a 2060 zero carbons net emissions. China's active in the Paris Accord, and China will, and the US will have to work with China and will want to work with China. And so there's going to be a lot of areas of the multilateral global commons space where the US will seek cooperation, but you can't cooperate if you've got a hostile relationship. So the US will obviously have to work with China in a much more cooperative way. And despite all the competitive tension that exists between China and the United States, or vice versa, of course, they still maintain the highest levels of political and diplomatic contact. Unlike us, they haven't been frozen out of that. And so it'll be an opportunity for Australia to start to reposition itself with China. And I think we should take that opportunity and particularly move away from this binary approach that we've been taking and look to find ways where we can engage China on a range of broader issues and begin to recognize some things that I think are important for the Chinese leadership, including the legitimacy of the Communist Party's rule and China's territorial integrity. And I don't think the US will be challenging those issues. Where it will be much more difficult in terms of China-US relations than it has been is over human rights. And Trump has been effectively mute on human rights. Mind you, Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo have been very, very confrontational on those issues as well. But I think you'll find a President Biden will be wanting to put a lot more pressure on China over human rights. And that's going to obviously introduce a further level of complexity into the management of the relationship. But overall, I think, Danny, that there is an opportunity for a resetting both of the US-China relationship and in that context for Australia to do the same.
Thanks, Geoff. So you mentioned there sort of strategic cooperation, and I guess those of us in business at Australia, that's sort of front of mind with what we've seen going on particularly in the political discourse over the last little while. We've obviously seen a number of challenges in our trade relationship with China reported in the media this year. Concerns are raised on, various export restrictions on Australian products. So what do you think's the best way for us to improve that relationship, and what kind of strategies do you think the federal government should adopt to restore the bilateral trade relationship, I guess?
Well, first and foremost, we have to work out for ourselves and for ourselves whether China's going to be a strategic competitor or someone that we have strategic cooperation with. That's quite fundamental, and I think there's great confusion. We talk the talk of cooperation and we walk the walk of containment and strategic competition. So I think we have to sort that out for ourselves. And possibly with the change of presidency in the US, that may provide us the space in which to do that. I wrote a couple of weeks ago that I believe China had made some positive gestures towards Australia, both with the speech at the end of August by the deputy at the Chinese embassy, Wang Xining, and also by more recently by an written interview, former ambassador to Australia, Madame Fu Ying, did with the Financial Review. We didn't respond positively in any way to those overtures. And then more recently, I think it's been extremely unfortunate, the incident involving Senator Ebbs and calling for loyalty statements from 3 Australian citizens of Chinese ethnic background. I think that really has been very damaging. That's because it goes to the Communist Party. He asked them to disavow the Communist Party. And if you follow what I was saying at the outset about the strategic objective of preserving Communist Party rule, I mean, anything that challenges that by politicians and of government members, not ministers, but government members, that is, I think, has a very big amplified effect back in Beijing, how they view us. So the next point really is that, and it's a big challenge for the Prime Minister, but we really have to have a much more discipline over our public statements coming out of not just ministers, but also members of the government and indeed the opposition as well. And I think people should think more about our bigger national interest than just a short-term political gain that comes from making some of these statements. Beyond that, I think we need to see, it would help very much if the Prime Minister would make a speech of some sort that recognised that China was going to be an important partner of Australia, and that we recognise China's contribution to our own well-being and economic living standards through the trade that we conduct, and foreshadowing working with China on a range of multilateral and regional issues, something that sets out some clear indicators which China could respond to. But it is a question of diplomacy, and we really do need to let the diplomats manage the path back to a more constructive relationship based on engagement.
I think that's a really important point. I think, there's been a number of people reflect in the media that we seem to have gone to a form of megaphone diplomacy, saying things in public as opposed to conducting things the way we used to, with diplomacy behind closed doors to address our valid issues, but then to make our points and work how we can work strategically together, rather than this context of containment that you talk about. So just on that point, with you talking about being aligned, Australia being aligned with the US on China containment via mechanisms such as the Quad, it's obvious, I'm assuming it's obvious to the people in Canberra that that will result in pushback from China, obvious pushback from China. And then potentially that then leads to trade and other economic outcomes for us that that we don't necessarily want. And we can't seem to find a way to coexist with the economic relationship and the security relationship.
That's right. I think the prevailing view in Canberra, though, is that Quad or no Quad, China will behave badly. So, what does it matter? And we're better off having a grouping of countries that can push back against China than not having it. And also that the current state of the bad relationship, the current bad state of the relationship, is the new normal. There is a very strong view in Canberra that Canberra does not need to do anything. All the fault lies on the Chinese side. If China wants to fix the relationship up, it's their business. They can do it. But for now, this is a perfectly comfortable state. And I think that's a big problem. And I think that goes to my point about this binary view of the world, which basically excludes diplomacy and either sees the world in terms of sycophancy or hostility. And it's just not an option for a country like Australia. And also the fact that we have become, by pursuing these policies, an outlier. So I said earlier, nearly all our neighbours, take Japan. Every day Japan has some sort of issue around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. And yet they are able to conduct government-to-government relations. They have trilateral meetings at ministerial level, foreign ministerial level. They've got all sorts of exchanges, and they've managed the situation for a very long time without having themselves put in the doghouse in the way we have. So it doesn't have to be the way it is, I guess, is my message. But very much that this is seen as the new normal in Canberra. And it's very hard to argue against that position if you accept their assumptions that there is only sycophancy or hostility.
So in that context, so one of our audience, Bruce McLaughlin, thanks for your question, Bruce. He's asked, he agrees that we need to have a policy towards China that's more independent of the US, but have you seen anything to suggest that's possible? And should Australian business plan on the basis that we might one day develop an independent policy towards China and repair our relationship? Or should we just assume that our government will continue on its current path, goading China where possible, and that business with China will always be difficult as a result of this?
Well, very good question, and also summarises, I think, the discussion we've just been having very well. When you hear people saying you must diversify away from China. Of course, that's obvious. Every business on earth, every country on earth would want to spread its risk. We are so heavily concentrated and dependent on the Chinese market for a very good reason. And as basic economics, the profound complementarity that exists between our economies. And sure, we can diversify, and we might have to if the relationship stays as it is, but that will be at a cost to our living standards. The West Australian lobster fishermen will not get the same price for the same massive volume of lobsters anywhere else in the world. That's why they sell all those lobsters to China. They're not doing it because they feel sorry the Chinese don't have enough to eat. It's just business, and that's what we have to understand. This is the situation we find ourselves in. That's why we need a realist foreign policy when we're dealing with China, and to take the world as we find it, and then work out how do we deal in a world where I make no excuses for China. It behaves badly from time to time. It's a bully from time to time. For reasons I try to set out, it seeks to interfere in other countries' internal affairs from time to time. Mind you, that is behaviour that could describe any great power at any time in history. Great powers behave like this. So I would hope, though, that a more realist view of how we deal with China prevails, and that we do try and navigate a way back to better relations. I'd always be encouraging businesses to look at diversification from the Chinese market, but it's not that easy. That is the real point. And to that extent, I think we need a better political discussion around how Australia deals with China. One, as I said, that works out how we navigate this relationship.
Yeah, look, we all get the economic theory around diversification. I think the latest stat I saw, it seems to change every week, is that we're one of 128 countries where China's our #1 trading partner. And I think, there's a significant distance to our second largest trading partner being Japan. So it's easier said than done. So I guess...
Sorry, Dad, just on that point, if I may, sorry. But very few countries have 40% of their exports going to one country.
Yeah, that's true.
So we are in a very unique position. That's why I sort of say that our foreign policy interests aren't exactly aligned with the US. They overlap in a lot of places. But the other thing is, other countries in our region who are also heavily dependent on China have navigated their relationships without it leading to this sort of tit for tat argument. And we could learn a lot from looking at our neighbours.
So I guess, Geoff, in the context of that concentration and our need to diversify, but acknowledging that that will take time, and in the context of our current geopolitical relationship, what can ACBC members, what can businesses in Australia, what actions can they take at the moment, do you think, to improve the situation, or at the very least sustain their business while transitioning to a more diverse customer base?
Well, the latter's up for the individual businesses, but I think the bigger point is business needs to have a voice around the issues of why it is Australian business is so heavily reliant on the Chinese market, why Australian business sees a very bright future growth opportunity in China, and we all know the answers to that. It's just size and income growth. And if you saw the, I took notice of the fifth plenum of the 19th Party Congress, was just held a week or so ago, and the discussion of the 14th five-year plan. In that context, the government laid out a longer-term plan of doubling China's per capita income again by 2035. So China's per capita income is about $15,000. That's across 1.4 billion people. You double that again, and 15 years is not that long ago. It's nearly just 15 years since I first went to Beijing as ambassador. That time flies. And so China will be utterly transformed again. So I think the government needs to get its head around these things. It really does. That business sees that we are going to have a high level of economic dependency on China, come what may, And therefore, it behoves the government to have policies around the relationship that's conducive to business, but also protect our national security. But another point I think business should be making is, of course, fundamental to national security is economic security. And you're not going to have national security if you don't have economic security. And the richer we are, the more capacity and resources we have to protect ourselves.
Yep. Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. So one of our attendees has asked, from their perspective, obviously, why is China so poor at soft power? Many people in this meeting have lived and worked in China, have no doubt enjoyed and loved the people, the food, the myths, the fables, the Chinese festivals. But why do you think they failed to project that internationally, and how could it change? And I guess, will it change? Maybe it won't change.
Well, look, we all appreciate and understand and embrace Chinese traditional culture, all the things that have been listed. But we're not talking about that. I mean, that could be soft power, and it is embraced internationally, widely. But the soft power I'm talking about is the soft power that's projected by the Chinese state, the party state. And as I said in my earlier remarks, it's because it goes through the filter, if you like, of the Chinese Communist Party ideology, that when it comes out the other end, it just doesn't sell well overseas. It's not authentic Chinese culture. It's Chinese Communist Party defined Chinese culture, and I think that is the problem. And of course, you have things like Confucius Institutes, which are highly controversial because of restrictions on what they can teach. Issues like Tibet are no-go areas. So then there are questions about academic freedom and integrity are raised. It does really, I just come back to my basic point, that it's a structural problem, and the structural problem for projecting soft power is the Communist Party.
Yeah. A challenging scenario. So shifting slightly, one of our audience members said, it's clear now that the heightened fear and dramatic shift of public opinion in Australia towards China has been deliberately driven by self-interest groups and think tanks, with the agenda of shifting every facet of Australia-China relations into the national security framework. We've talked a bit about this, but how does this new paradigm fit our national interest? And again, what can we in the business community do to help provide some balance there?
Well, I think the question really has been addressed by what's been said. Certainly, the latter part of it we've just been discussing. But I'll reiterate, maybe in a shorter form, that business needs to help government understand that China is essential to our economic well-being. That's not going to change. We have a choice to be richer or poorer, but economic security is fundamental to national security. And I think they're important points to be made. And also that business looks to have a constructive relationship with China, and that we aren't dealing with binary choices here. There are ways to manage the relationship. We have in the past, and there's no reason why we won't in the future. But management of the bilateral relationship between Australia and China needs to rest with the diplomats and not with the intelligence security people, because it is going to be a very big challenge for diplomacy. And at the end of the book, I have 10 points for the foundation of Australia-China relations. And the last point, well, the first point basically, I won't go through the whole 10, I can't remember them all, to be frank. But the first one is, obviously continued US presence in the region. The last point, though, addresses the transactional issue. We need to engage with China much more in terms of non-transactional issues, cultural issues, engagement people to people, and so on. And we need to do a lot more of that. But so, yeah, I mean, I set out a couple of things. One, I set out how to manage the bilateral relationship through the 10 points. But I also, clear-headed about this, that we need hedging strategies against China. And so the things we do in diplomacy, we should be doing in good company always, working with like-minded countries, working to build coalitions. As I said, I think the Quad in its current form, the way it's formulated, is about containment of China, but we can have other regional groupings. The Quad could become a quint or an oct with 8 members, and New Zealand should be in, and Indonesia, and whoever else, Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, whatever. So it's important that we do have an activist middle power diplomacy, which we've basically given up on, and return to that, and try and encourage the formulation of groupings or engagement with other countries, which will remind China that bad behavior carries costs and can lean back against China to some extent. Hedging is not containment, and if we're pursuing a hedging strategy, it should also be very transparent, and China should know what we're doing. We don't need to be secretive about a hedging strategy, because China would understand that it's not countries can't base their security just on the assumption of benign behavior. You have to have contingencies and prepare for non-benign behavior, but equally that still provides the space for China to continue to grow.
So just on that comment you made about a hedging strategy and doing things in good company, do you think that's the flashpoint that sort of kicked off the latest round of deterioration, when we sort of went it alone, or Prime Minister Morrison went it alone to call for a COVID inquiry?
Yeah, very much so. And there was no need for that to have been done the way it was done. Trying to think about it, how did that happen? I'm speculating, but it seems to me that it comes from the context. If you see China in this binary way that I'm saying, and you only have 1 or 2 choices, then it's easy to sort of forget about the need to build coalitions. It's you feel you're on the side of the angels if you just come out and blurt out that we need an inquiry. And also the context at the time. Trump was heavily attacking China precisely at that time for the Wuhan virus, the China virus, and that sort of thing. It was just so badly judged that we would walk into the middle of that. And I think they're the sorts of things, that's why you need diplomacy to be like the ruler of diplomacy, to be put across all policy before we do things.
So just on the point of diplomacy, I was listening to Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull on Insiders on the weekend, and I think one of Kevin's contentions was that, and you mentioned Japan earlier on, and its long challenged relationship with China, but still they managed to find a way, notwithstanding the challenges, to deal with China and to manage that relationship. Could we understand, or could we learn from Japan in terms of its diplomatic approach to China? And indeed, as asked by one of our people on the call today, could we learn from Korea and how it responded to the THAAD missile crisis a few years ago, and managed to navigate its way through that?
Absolutely. And I heard Kevin say that, and I was very pleased to hear him say it. And in a sense, that's what I'm saying in my book as well, that we have made ourselves an outlier. We need to look around at our neighbours, including Japan, South Korea, even New Zealand, who have our values, share our values, have our democratic institutions, are as keen as we are to protect and preserve them, but have also managed in their own interests to have maintained quite good relations with China. You can do more than one thing, but we've really painted ourselves into a very strange place.
Thanks, Geoff. It's been, I'm sure everyone will agree, it's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we could go on for a fair while longer. There's certainly plenty of questions coming up in the Q&A box, but I'm mindful of time. So again, on behalf of ACBC members and us at Shinewing, thanks very much for your involvement and sharing your thoughts today. I guess everyone get out and grab a hold of Geoff's latest book if you want to have some deeper insight. I need to have a free plug in there for you.
Thanks, Danny.
And thank you again, and I'll hand you back to Virginia.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks, Geoff. That was terrific. You've thrown out some incredible challenges for ACBC too, and I've been taking notes because I think, you know, your comments on businesses needing to help government to understand the importance of China. Interesting, you know, that we need a voice on why we are reliant on China as well. And back in 2013, ACBC did a household report. It used to be an annual document, and in that time it was showing that $16,985 value to each Australian household from the trade that we did with China. So that is an amazing figure, and as you say, if exports are dropping off, that will obviously affect every single household in Australia. And I think we need to make sure that we realise that and get that message out clearly. So thank you so much for the breadth of your expertise and conversation today, and Danny for some terrific moderating and questions as well. So I appreciate both of your support. Shining also for your sponsorship today. Geoff, I think we would love to come back again at some stage and have another conversation with you. And I think this is fascinating as it unfolds, particularly as the US presidency comes into effect with Joe Biden. Thank everyone who helped organise behind the scenes today to get the event up and running, and the staff at ACBC. We have a couple of terrific events coming up, one with the CSIRO on drought on the 18th, and also a health tech innovation event as part of the Australia-China Economic Trade Investment Expo on the 20th. So I encourage you to keep an eye on the website or your inboxes for that information. We'll also be sending you out a summary of today's event. So check your junk mail in case it goes in there, but we've also, we'll have the dot points and also a link to ordering Geoff's book if you are wanting to avail yourself of the discount offer. So thank you all very much for attending today, to both of our wonderful speakers for their time and sharing your expertise, and to our wonderful guests for Zooming in. So I wish you all a wonderful day and hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Virginia. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Virginia.
Bye-bye.